Today, we're diving into a fascinating 6-year rebellion that shook the foundations of the Achaemenid Empire in the 5th century BCE. Our story centers on Inarus, a Libyan leader who spearheaded a significant uprising in Egypt and Libya. This revolt took place during the reign of Artaxerxes I, either in 464 or 463 BCE, a mere few months or a year after the death of his father Xerxes in 465 BCE. It's crucial to remember that this wasn't an isolated incident. Rebellions in Egypt had been simmering since its conquest by Cambyses, king of Persia, in 525 BCE. The primary accounts of these tumultuous events come to us mainly from Greek sources, specifically 4 key historians: Herodotus, Thucydides, Diodorus Siculus, and Ctesias. I want to briefly introduce the latter, Ctesias. Hailing from Cnidus, a city in what is now southern Turkey, he was born in the 5th century BCE. After the Achaemenids invaded his homeland, Ctesias served as a physician to the king of Persia, accompanying him on various endeavors. He authored several books, of whom we know the Persica and the Indica, most of which are now lost and survive only through the works of other ancient authors. In the context of our current discussion, the events he described in the Persica are transmitted to us primarily through the Bibliotheca of the Byzantine scholar Photius. Having established the historical context and the invaluable sources that illuminate this period, let us now turn our attention to the immediate precursors of Inaros's revolt. Against this backdrop of a newly installed king and a history of Egyptian discontent, a significant event unfolded concurrently. Interestingly, shortly before Inaros's rebellion erupted, the newly crowned King Artaxerxes I had his hands full. According to Ctesias, he was occupied quelling a revolt in the distant province of Bactria, led by its own satrap. This internal strife within the Persian Empire, combined with the recent death of Xerxes, served as a powerful catalyst. Diodorus Siculus suggests these events emboldened the Egyptians to rise up once more and crown Inaros as their king. However, Thucydides presents a slightly different narrative, asserting that Inaros himself initiated the rebellion across the entirety of Egypt, both upper and lower, launching his campaign from the city of Marea. Ctesias, on the other hand, describes the Egyptian rebellion as being led by Inaros the Libyan and another, unnamed Egyptian leader. The exact identity of this second Egyptian leader remains a subject of historical debate. Some scholars suggest it could be Amirteus, a figure also recognized in historical literature as a prominent rebel against the Persians. This assumption is based on various facts that we will delve into later in our discussion. Around 463–462 BCE, Inaros, recognizing the need for powerful allies, dispatched a request to the Athenians, urging them to join his war against the Persians. The Athenians, sharing a common enemy, readily accepted. However, the precise number of ships and the overall effectiveness of the Athenian intervention in this rebellion vary significantly depending on the historical account. Thucydides, for instance, tends to minimize the Athenian role. He states that 200 Athenian ships, originally on an expedition against Cyprus, were simply redirected to the mouths of the Nile. Upon their arrival, they discovered that Inarus's forces had already secured control of almost all of Egypt, with the exception of the White Castle, where Persian and Median forces were currently under siege. Diodorus Siculus, conversely, offers a different perspective on this particular aspect. For him, the intervention of these 200 Athenian ships was absolutely crucial for achieving victory against the Persians. He recounts that the combined armies of Libya and Egypt were strategically awaiting their Athenian allies before engaging the enemy, who were then subsequently besieged in the White Fortress, precisely as Thucydides also noted. It is important to approach Diodorus's narrative with a degree of caution, as he is known through other writings to exhibit a pro-Athenian bias. Ctesias, in his account, introduces several details not mentioned by the other historians. Regarding Athenian participation, he explicitly states that they sent 40 ships, commanded by the Athenian admiral Charitimides. This admiral achieved a notable naval victory, triumphing over 50 Persian ships, capturing 30, and destroying the remaining 20. Another unique detail from Ctesias concerns clashes with the Persians before the siege of Memphis, which was known as the White Fort. He tells us that Artaxerxes initially intended to lead the campaign himself, but his companions dissuaded him. Instead, he dispatched Achaemenes, or more accurately, Achaemenes, his uncle, and the satrap of Egypt. Achaemenes led a formidable army of 400,000 infantry and 80 ships, a count that includes the 50 vessels Charitimides would later defeat. The fate of Achaemenes was brutal. Inaros personally killed him and sent his body back to his nephew Artaxerxes. Herodotus also alludes to this event, and thanks to him we know this decisive battle was fought at Paprimis. It's also worth highlighting that Ctesias does not mention the Persians being besieged in Memphis at all. Around 462–461 BCE, following this devastating defeat in Egypt, Artaxerxes, according to Thucydides and Diodorus, resorted to a diplomatic maneuver. He dispatched the general Megabazus, armed with a substantial amount of money, to persuade the Lacedaemonians, more commonly known as the Spartans, to ally with the Persians. The goal was to attack the Athenians, thereby forcing them to withdraw from Egypt. However, these efforts proved futile, and the Persians merely lost a significant sum of money. While the Persians remained besieged in the White Fort of Memphis for approximately a year and a half, they were concurrently preparing a new, powerful army for the reconquest of Egypt. This formidable force was placed under the joint command of Artabazus and Megabazus. Ctesias claims this army comprised 200,000 infantry and 300 ships, which, he asserts, were somehow still present in Egypt under the leadership of Oriscos, bringing the total Persian forces to over 500,000. Diodorus, on the other hand, estimates the army at more than 300,000, encompassing both cavalry and infantry, alongside 300 ships. He further elaborates that the war preparations spanned an entire year, and that, prior to advancing into Egypt, the forces rested along the coasts of Cilicia and Phoenicia. Here they were also resupplied with ships and reinforced with various weapons by Cyprians, Phoenicians, and Cilicians. The Persians eventually ventured back into Egypt, and after more than a year of campaigning, they successfully broke the siege of Memphis. According to Ctesias, Megabyzos personally wounded Inaros in the thigh, forcing the Libyan king to flee to the city of Byblos, which corresponds to the island of Prosopitis in the accounts of Thucydides and Diodorus. With this, all of Egypt once again fell under Persian control, and the rebels found themselves besieged on Prosopitis. Both Thucydides and Diodorus agree that the Persians broke the 18-month siege of Prosopitis using a clever engineering technique. Since Prosopitis was an island, they drained the canal separating it from the mainland, effectively turning it into a peninsula. This rendered the Athenian ships useless, as they were now stranded on dry land. However, the authors diverge on what transpired next. Diodorus states that following this ingenious move, the Egyptians eagerly hastened to negotiate terms with the Persians. The Athenians, however, stood courageous on Prosopitis, deliberately burning their own ships to prevent the Persians from using them, and prepared to confront the enemy. He continues, asserting that Artabazus and Megabazus were so impressed by the Athenians' heroism that they offered a truce, allowing them safe passage back to their homeland via Cyrene in Libya, with no lives lost. While Diodorus may have been biased toward Athens, Thucydides appears to offer a more realistic account. He simply states that the Persians took Prosopitis by force, with only a few Athenians surviving. These survivors attempted to reach Cyrene, but only a handful managed to endure the harsh realities of the Libyan desert. For Thucydides, the 6-year revolt largely concludes here. Yet he introduces another rebel figure, Amirteus. This Amirteus, he recounts, escaped captivity and subsequently ruled over the marshlands, whose inhabitants were renowned for their bravery. Herodotus also mentions Inaros alongside Amirteus among Persia's most formidable enemies. However, this alone isn't enough to definitively identify him as Inaros's Egyptian companion. Moreover, there's a possibility that 2 different Amirteus figures existed, both related and both having fought the Persians. Anyway, returning to our main narrative, Thucydides' account doesn't quite end there. He continues his critique of the Athenian participation, highlighting a move that led to heavy losses for them. After the siege concluded, the Athenians dispatched 50 ships, which ventured into the Nile, only to be largely destroyed by the surrounding enemy forces, with only a few managing to escape. As for Inaros himself, Thucydides reports that he was eventually betrayed and impaled, without precising the circumstances of the incident. The conclusion of the revolt differs significantly in Ctesias's account. He states that Inaros's forces and the Greeks, numbering around 6,000, fortified themselves in Byblos, which Megabyzos found impregnable. Consequently, Megabyzos opted to forge a peace treaty with Inaros, promising that none of them would be harmed. The Greeks were granted permission to return home whenever they wished. Following this, he appointed Sarsamas as the new satrap of Egypt and returned to Persia, accompanied by Inaros and some Greeks, to meet King Artaxerxes. The king, however, was furious about the peace treaty his general had made. After much begging and persuasion from Megabyzos, the king eventually relented, and Inaros and the Greeks were allowed to live. Yet Amestris, the mother of Achaemenes, who, you'll recall, was killed by Inaros earlier, vowed to avenge her son. She implored Megabyzos to allow her to fulfill her intentions, but he consistently refused. She then made the same plea to King Artaxerxes, who, after 5 years, finally granted her wish, allowing her to impale Inaros on 3 stakes and behead 50 of the Greeks. For Megabyzos, this was an unforgivable betrayal. He had given pledges of faith to Inaros and the Greeks, guaranteeing their safety. The general who once fought a rebel would himself become one. He secretly aided the remaining Greeks in their escape, and, years later, prepared for another revolt of his own. Beyond the accounts of Greek historians, the legacy of Inaros also appears in scattered inscriptions and artifacts that shed light on how he was remembered. For example, a Greek inscription from Samos records a dedication made by Inaros, son of Psamatechus, to Leokritos of Samos as a commemoration of his leadership and help in Inaros's campaign. Another artifact come from the Achaemenid Empire, known as the Svenigorodsky seal, dating from the 5th to 4th centuries BCE, has been interpreted in various ways regarding its depiction of kings. In our specific context, Richard Arthur Martin proposed that it illustrates Emperor Artaxerxes slaying Inaros the Libyan, and that the 4 men depicted before the emperor represent the Greek generals who fought alongside him. Turning to Egypt itself, an ostracon from Ain Manawir in the Dakhla oasis offers another intriguing testimony. The document, whose main subject was a transaction over water rights, dated the agreement by reference to the 2nd year of reign of Inaros. At first, this seemed to confirm Inaros's role as a rebel leader, since the text was read as Inaros, chief of the rebels. However, more recent scholarship has proposed a different reading: Inaros, chief of the Bakalu. This Bakalu are identified to be the same as the Bakales, were a Libyan tribe of Cyrenaica, known from Herodotus and other ancient writers. This raises an important question. Does the ostracon refer to the same Inaros who defied Persia, or to another Inaros altogether? Some specialists believe it points instead to an earlier Inaros, a heroic figure remembered in Egyptian tradition for his wars against the Assyrians. Indeed, there was more than one Inaros in Egyptian history, and distinguishing between them requires attention to both archaeological and literary sources. Unlike the Inaros of the Persian Wars, the material about the earlier Inaros of Ethribis is extensive, though fragmentary, and less securely dated. He is linked to the turbulent 7th century BCE, when Egypt under the 25th dynasty was locked in repeated conflict with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. In Assyrian records from the reigns of Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, 5 local rulers appear: Necho, Petubastis, Pekrur, Necha, Bokenephe, as significant roles in the revolt against Assyrian occupation during the rule of Esarhaddon and his son Ashurbanipal. Of particular relevance is Bokenephe, prince and ruler of Ethribis, who has been identified as the father of this earlier Inaros according to an unpublished papyrus of the Inaros epic. Bokenephe himself, according to a statue in Berlin, was descended from Peteise, ruler of Ethribis and chief of the Meshwesh Libyans under the 23rd dynasty, according to the Pie Stela. Even the name Inaros reflects layers of identity and resistance. It is a Hellenized form of the Egyptian Iret Heruru, meaning the eye of Horus is set against them, the enemies. An Aramaic version, Yenharu, is attested in the Sheikh Fadl inscription, likely from the 5th century BCE, which also recounts elements of revolt. Another Aramaic letter from Elephantine records Arsames writing to Artahant to demand the release of slaves seized by a wicked Yinharu, likely Inaros of the Persian revolt. Assyrian documents, too, may preserve his name. In their lists of rulers, the name of Bokenephe as prince of Athribis seems replaced by another figure reconstructed as Nicherau, plausibly an Inaros. This complex interplay between historical memory and evolving tradition eventually gave rise to a full literary cycle, the so-called Cycle of Inarus, formerly known as the Cycle of Petubastis, preserved a long series of demotic stories from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. These tales, written centuries later, portray Inarus not merely as a Libyan rebel, but as a heroic champion of Egypt, probably the most famous national hero for Egypt at that time. The cycle includes the Inaros epic. Its story is set in the reign of Necho and concerns the living Inaros and his allies Necho and Pekrur against the Assyrians. The main fragment seemed to include a letter, probably containing a military challenge from Esarhaddon to Inaros, a duel at the Red Sea between Inaros and an Assyrian sorceress who changes her shape into that of a griffin, and a clandestine visit by the hero Pekrur to Esarhaddon's sleeping quarters. The struggle for the armor of Inaros concerns the activities of the family of Inaros and their allies immediately after Inaros's death and burial, especially as they attempt to recover the armor of Inaros that has been seized by the ruler of Mendes. The struggle for the prebend of Ammon has little to do with Inaros, as it concerns a dispute over a priestly endowment between Unshhor, son of Pitubastus, and his opponents, the first prophet of Ammon in Thebes and the high priest of Horus in Buto. It does, however, include two sons of Inarus, Pami and Minimai, and Pitichons, son of Pekrur, Inarus's old ally, who eventually fight on behalf of Enshor's claims to the endowment. The Egyptians and the Amazons relates the campaign of Pitacons, son of Pekrur, to Asia. In this story, the Egyptians are allied with the Assyrians against an army of women, and Pitacons falls in love with the Amazonian queen, Serpot. In addition, the dead Inaros appears to Pitacons, and throughout the stories in which Inaros is no longer living, he is often called King Osiris Inaros and given offerings. These literary works emerged during an era when Egypt was no longer governed by its native rulers, but by foreign powers. They served as a form of resistance literature, designed to remind the native Egyptians of the glorious days of their nation, and to inspire them toward political independence and cultural autonomy. In the end, Inaros is more than a name from a dusty chronicle. Whether he fought Persians or Assyrians, or lived only in the stories told centuries later, he became the kind of figure people cling to when the world feels lost. Part warrior, part legend, a reminder that even when empires fade, the idea of resistance keeps finding a voice.